With Sparkle's release, the Mono Quantum Dream Team is finally complete. But is there more to Sparkle than meets the eye? Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video. And as the latest Quantum Harmony unit, Sparkle is our second ever action value manipulation unit following Bronya, a powerhouse of a support since the launch of the game. With crit damage buff, damage percentage buff, skill points generation and action value advance, Sparkle might be a lot more universal than her initial impressions. Without further ado, let's get into today's content. So jumping straight into a character kit, like I've mentioned in my previous video in Sparkle's pre-release analysis, her basic attack, abilities, traces are essentially more or less covered, so I wouldn't be going into super in-depth. I just want to give you guys as much useful information as possible, right? So for her basic attack monodrama, we do know for now that Sparkle's trace grants her basic attack the same energy generation that her skill has, which is 30 energy. While basic attack is not optimal in a hyper carry setup, where you want Sparkle's action value advance and the crit damage buff to have as much coverage as possible, it does bring flexibility in very specific niche situations, such as Imbibito Lune using his 3 skill point enhanced basic attack every single turn, or perhaps even a dual DPS team comp where both your DPS can use skills more frequently, although the latter it is not as viable, which I'll be explaining why later on. Alright, so jumping into Sparkle's skill Dream Diver, it increases crit damage by 24% of a crit damage plus 45% lasting 1 turn, and action forward this ally's action by 50%. So this skill in particular has an even higher crit damage scaling than Bronya's ultimate. A 50% action value advance is with a roughly 90% crit damage buff, assuming that your Sparkle has close to 200% crit damage, is a really strong skill buff for a hyper carry unit, and likely one of the best hyper carry buffs in the entire game compared to like your Bronya skill, Tianyuan skill, your Hanya's buffs, all that kind of stuff. Right? Keep in mind that this 50% action value advance, it is not an extra turn like Bronya, which means speed tuning Sparkle is going to be extremely important. You can't expect Sparkle's skill to give your DPS an extra turn every single time because it's only 50% of the action value advance, so something to keep in mind. Now jumping into her ultimate, the hero with 1000 phases, 110 energy, recovers 4 skill points, and additionally give the Cypher effect, which increases the damage boost provided by Sparkle's talent, which I'll be explaining a bit later on. But for this ultimate, the effect lasts for 2 turns, and it is essentially Sparkle's bread and butter, because at 110 energy cost, a 3-turn ultimate energy is basically guaranteed with an energy regeneration rope, right? With 3 skills or 3 basic attacks even, 5 energy, that's 95 energy. And with 19.4% energy regeneration, that will give you 113 energy. So you're guaranteed to have a 3-turn ultimate rotation no matter what. This also provides us with the whopping 4 skill points, and it might give a misconception to players that Sparkle is extremely skill point positive, but keep in mind, this is only if you use Sparkle's basic attack to generate energy. Since her basic attack generates the same energy as her skill, Sparkle's skill point positivity can be tuned accordingly between +1 all the way to +7 across 3 turns, depending on the scenario she's presented with. You would be using Sparkle's skill every single turn to gain the maximum mileage from the action value advance as well as the crit damage buff. With that being said, there are situations which has emergency usages that can see Sparkle using a basic attack, such as maybe your team is dying, you need an additional heal, you need to allocate skill points to your sustains, or if your DPS just miraculously ran out of skill points because of poor skill point management, but ideally you just want to use Sparkle's skill, but you can adjust accordingly, right? Very briefly, her talent, Red Herring, which is increase maximum number of skill points by 2, so now your maximum skill point is up to 7, and whenever any ally consumes 1 skill point, all of our allies' damage percentage increased by 6%, lasts for 2 turns up to 3 times. The raise skill point to a maximum of 7, it is to essentially account for ultimate and technique, while providing the team a 18% damage buff permanently as long as skill points are consumed. Although the damage multipliers are very low at only 18%, but this does go up to 48% under the effects of Sparkle's ultimate Cypher, right? Because it is additional 10% per stack, and then you get an additional 30% for a total of 48%. Unlikely for Sparkle to be a good fit of a dual DPS team comp compared to Runmei, because you guys might think, oh, we have a team-wide damage percentage buff, right? And therefore she might be a good dual DPS support. But like I mentioned earlier on, Sparkle's main support benefits is usually tied to her skill. which is the action value advance and the crit damage buff. And unless you unlock Sparkle's Eidolons, which I'll explain later on, she's not really that great of a dual DPS support, and that role will still be reserved for Run Mei. And lastly, Sparkle's technique grants all allies stealth for 20 seconds. It might see some use in the overall, and the main point is entering the battle while recovering 3 skill points for the entire team. With this, it allows our team to start with 6 skill points on the go, greatly front-loading Sparkle's buff multipliers as she essentially gets a 3 free skill cards. And this allows Sparkle to permanently maintain skill point positivity as long as we use her technique. So it will never be a situation where your Sparkle is skill point negative, right? As long as you use technique, it will always be at least +1 skill point, going all the way up to +7 skill point, right? So that is basically Sparkle's kit. And jumping straight into her tracers, she has 24% HP, 10% effect rest, and 24% crit damage. All of them excellent tracers, right? Almanac, when using basic attack, recovers 10 energy. Like I mentioned earlier, it allows Sparkle to have the flexibility between using a skill and a basic attack to generate sufficient skill points without affecting our ultimate R-time. She'll always have 3-turn ultimate rotation, so really decent. Artificial Flower, the crit damage boost lasts until the start of the next turn. Like I mentioned previously, very powerful trace. The main beneficiaries from this is our follow-up attackers such as Jingyuan, Dr. Ratio, and Topaz, right? Because they can gain the benefit of Sparkle's crit damage buff even after their turn has ended. So that's something to keep in mind. And lastly, Nocturne, increase all allies attack by 15%, and whenever they're up to 3 quantum allies allies attack are increased by 5, 15, and 30% respectively. So this is not as impactful as other tracers, especially since other than our Hyper Carry, Scylla, and Qingque, the attack percentage buff isn't that beneficial for everyone else, unless in a mono quantum scenario you're running a crit Silver Wolf, right? DPS Silver Wolf. But even so, the effects of the attack percentage is just really not that great. Furthermore, there are situations where you can run Sparkle with a mixed support, such as Bronya, Run Mei, Tingyun, which will probably be even more beneficial than Silver Wolf, especially if the target is already weak to quantum. So because of this, this trace is not that important, or rather not as useful compared to others. I mean, at the end of the day, you're still going to unlock everything, but just in terms of priority, right? Now, jumping into Sparkle's Eidolons, her E1, it provides a pretty well-rounded 48% damage buff and 40% attack buff that lasts for 3 turns, which perfectly synergizes with Sparkle's 3-turn ultimate rotation, right? So as long as you get this E1, now you have an additional 40% attack buff. A decent upgrade, but the key Eidolon for Sparkle ties to her Eidolon 2, which each talent stack allows allies to ignore 8% of the target's defense when dealing damage to the enemies, which is essentially defense penetration, right? Up to a 24% defense reduction at the full stacks applied to the entire team. And this is pretty much Sparkle's game-changing Eidolon. It could potentially make dual DPS more viable, and it definitely makes the Hyper Carry setup deal a lot more damage. Coupled with the likelihood of using Sparkle in, like, for example, a mono quantum team comp, so if you're going to be using 4-piece quantum, Silver Wolf in a mono quantum set, a DPS with Sparkle's E2 can very likely reach close to 100% defense reduction and deal a ton of damage, right? Moving on to Sparkle's E4, the ultimate recovers 1 more skill point, and the talent increase max skill point by 1. So it basically means that your base is now +2 to +8 instead of +1 to +7. At this particular point from E4 onwards, players will start to notice that as Sparkle's Eidolons increase, her position starts to shift more towards a dual DPS support instead of a Hyper Carry support, because now you have a lot more skill points, and for a Hyper Carry team comp, it is not as impactful because most of the time, Hyper Carry team comps, except for Imbued Lune and Qingque, don't really have a lot of skill point pressure, right? And the only units that really face this skill point pressure is when you start to pivot towards dual DPS team comps. So something to keep in mind, and E4 is really not that important, and E6 is pretty much where you are fully committed to turning Sparkle into a dual DPS support, right? The crit damage boost effect increases by 30% of Sparkle's crit damage, so her crit damage scaling goes up by another 30%, and this crit damage boost is now applied to the entire team with Cypher. Remember, this is with Cypher, so it is only during the duration of our ultimate. Pretty much another game-changing ultimate. First point being the crit damage scaling, it drastically improves from 24% to 54%, which provides a much larger incentives for our whales with better crit damage relics to scale even further with Sparkle. And for new whales who are intending to get a dual DPS support and you guys have missed out on Run Mei's banner, E6 Sparkle with the team white crit damage buff can definitely see some very nice use, in particular, for example, Doctor Ratio and Topaz. So in summary, Sparkle, she pretty much has a complete kit even at E0, with the strongest power spike being E2, and if you want to completely change Sparkle from a hyper carry support to a dual DPS support, then you can get her E6. Now Sparkle's energy threshold is very simplistic. I do want to focus a little bit more on the speed threshold, which is something that I have not done for a very long time. But first, let's talk about the energy thresholds. She has a extremely simplistic threshold since she gains 30 energy no matter use a basic attack or a skill, and the ultimate has 110 energy cost. It is not worth it to try and achieve a 2-turn ultimate because it's extremely difficult, and it is pretty much impossible to get a 4-turn ultimate unless you don't use energy regeneration rope, which does not make sense. You will always run that, right? So her rotation, very straightforward. 3 skills, 3 basic attack, with 1 ER, you'll get 113.43 energy, which is the perfect for 3-turn ultimate. No explanation needed, you just pretty much run with this. If you guys want to consider running a 2-turn ultimate, it is possible by trying out using Coggers or Memories of the Past, right? So if you have 2 basic attack, you run a 2-piece Vonweg or Penacony, which brings your energy regeneration to 24.4%, you will be at 100.76 energy, and you will get a 2-turn ultimate if you get hit or you get external sources such as Run Mei Signature Lightcone or Huo's ultimate, right? So you could potentially do a 2-turn ultimate, but it is not really recommended because if you were to do this, your Sparkle is pretty much not using her skill, which doesn't make sense. Like I mentioned, Sparkle's main kit, you do want her to use skill as much as possible, right? So really would not recommend this setup. So most of the time, just stick with the ER rope, 3-turn ultimate rotation, very straightforward. But now, this is pretty much the most important part of the Sparkle guide, which is the speed thresholds. And it has been a very long time since we have had a speed threshold segment in CN unit analysis. And Sparkle's speed tuning is pretty much one of the most important part to play Sparkle optimally. CN has pretty much summarized 3 variations players can look into, namely the slow Sparkle, the 160 Sparkle, and the hyper speed Sparkle. For the slow Sparkle, your speed is pretty much going to be 133.4 or 134, and you will be using this with a fast DPS. You will be playing Sparkle similar to a Bronya variation, doing your DPS into Sparkle, into DPS, into Sparkle, into DPS, right? At least for the very first turn. Since action value advance is only 50%, it will be a slightly weaker variation than Bronya, as she cannot grant DPS 4 actions on the very first cycle, right? Bronya can grant 4, Sparkle you can only grant 3, since it's only 50% action value advance. So the benefits of running slow Sparkle, it is essentially you can now allocate more substats into your crit damage, right? Less speed stats, more crit damage stats, right? So for a slightly higher burst when you use your skill. So the cons of running speed Sparkle is that for the very first DPS action, you will not receive Sparkle's crit damage buff, right? Because your DPS is faster than Sparkle. When DPS goes for the very first time, it will not receive any buffs from Sparkle. Also, it will force your DPS to stack on 134 plus speed, which means your DPS will need to sacrifice more offensive stats, right? Because your offensive stats go into 134 speed, it could have otherwise went into attack boots, it could have otherwise went into your crit rate, crit damage subs. So generally speaking, slow Sparkle, it is not the best variation. Better variation, which most players should be looking to run, is the 160 Sparkle, or specifically 160.1. And you will pretty much be using this Sparkle for every single team comps, right? Every single DPS will probably run this. So the minimum speed required to hit 4 actions in 2 cycles is 160.1 speed. And now, using this variation, your DPS speed is now effectively tied to Sparkle speed. Whatever your Sparkle speed is pretty much equivalent to whatever your DPS speed is, forcing Sparkle to use a skill every single turn, which transforms our DPS to also having 160.1 speed. It allows our DPS to pretty much go all in into damage, right? Don't care about speed boots, don't care about speed substats, and just go all in attack, crit rate, crit damage. But that being said, you do need to be aware of enemy crowd controls, or if your Sparkle miraculously ran out of skill points to cast a skill. So that would be something to keep in mind. We are equipping Sparkle with a Vonweg 2-piece, Ego 4-piece, or any dance in the team, then this will bring Sparkle to the best variation in my opinion, which is the Hyper Speed Sparkle. For Hyper Speed Sparkle, it can go anywhere between 151.4 all the way to 184 speed Sparkle. And this is the variation you would want for specifically 0 cycles. The aim of this is to complete 3 actions on the very first turn, right? The very first cycle. The hyperspeed concept can pretty much be also applied to every other support, right? While seemingly we do have a lower speed needed than the 160 sparkle, such as the 151.4. This is because 151.4 speed will require 2 Dance and a Wind 4-piece equipped, creating a 4,800 action value and a 2,500 action value advance. So kindly refer to this screenshot that I'm going to be showing over here. Quick refresher, I will probably be making a separate video to go a little bit more in depth. One action requires 10,000 action value, and any action value advance pretty much reduces the amount needed to complete one action. And then you will divide this action value by 150, since that is the denominator for our very first cycle. I will be going forward more in depth in this in the future, but just know that this is gonna be the formula. And now moving on to the rest of the guides, it is pretty much more or less straightforward, because the most important part of the entire Sparkle guide is basically the speed threshold. Once you got down the speed thresholds, the rest is very straightforward. So for Relics, running a Eagle 4-piece, it will greatly help to reduce Sparkle's speed requirement to hit the necessary speed benchmarks. In fact, Eagle 4-piece is more impactful and universal than Hackerspace 4-piece, and CN has been using Eagle 4-piece as their go-to support set for pretty much all 0 cycles, right? But that being said, it is not very efficient to farm Eagle 4-piece since the 2-piece effect for Eagle is completely useless. You have to go 4-piece or nothing, right? And very little DPS actually utilize the Hunter 4-piece. Hackerspace and Longevous, they have really good 2-piece effects that allows players to mix and match, which brings us to the alternative, which is Hackerspace 2-piece plus any 2-piece, right? As long as we hit the speed threshold for Sparkle, you are good to go. 2-piece Von Weg will be preferred since it will help Sparkle reach her necessary speed thresholds. However, if players are not interested in the 3 actions in the very first cycle, then any of the following will work, right? Fleetless, Kill, Penacony. Specifically, Kill will work the best since Sparkle, she does have an innate 10% effect rest, and the crit damage buff from Kill, it also provides Sparkle even more scaling, right? The 10% crit damage, it is also granted to Sparkle itself, right? Fleetless is not really optimal since you will never run Sparkle with DOT team comps, whereas Penacony is only if you run Sparkle with Sile and Qingquan. And then moving on to her main stats and substats, like I said, very straightforward. You just give her as much speed as she needs to hit the speed thresholds, and the rest of the stuff can go into crit damage, right? Everything else is secondary, so you basically find the relics with the best speed and crit damage substats and adjust accordingly. So for your main stat, crit damage chest, speed boots, energy rope, HP or defense field. And then for your substats, highest priority, crit damage chest, speed, and then HP, defense, effect rest, and then pretty much everything else, right? So very easy to gear. Now, jumping into Sparkle's lightcones, her S1, Earthly Escabade, kind of like her best in slot, it gives her 32% crit damage buff, and it improves our Sparkle's crit damage buff scaling, as well as a team-wide 48 crit value buff, which is 10% crit rate and 20% crit damage. But note that this buff, it will not have 100% uptime if the wearer does not recover skill points fast enough, right? Because we only grant the stacks upon recovering skill points, and usually your supports only generate 1 skill point per turn. So it might not be very universal if the battle drags on for prolonged periods of time. But that being said, as one Earthly Escabade, it is possible to stack on multiple copies of the effects of this lightcone to obtain multiple 48 crit value buffs. So in a 0 cycle scenario, this might see interesting usage, especially for whales who want to speedrun anything. But this is very niche because, as I mentioned, after 3 turns, this buff will fall off unless your support starts to generate skill points. And even your supports, you still need to use skills with your supports, right? Like your Ting Yuan, your Bronya, you still use your skills. So it will take quite a bit to actually generate this buff back up again, unless you are Sparkle. So keep that in mind. And another alternative is basically our S5 Dance. Sparkle's energy threshold, it is not tied to any specific lightcones, such as Coggers, Memories of the Past, or Bronya's signature lightcone. And she also doesn't lose that much of a core kit without Earthly Escabade's crit damage buff. And as such, having Dance, it allows Sparkle to hit her necessary speed thresholds to perform either a 3 action on the first cycle or 4 action in 2 cycles, reducing Sparkle's speed requirements and opens up more substats to allocate to crit damage. Note that Dance is also stackable. You can run 2 Dance or even 3 Dance for 3 harmony units, as mentioned previously, right? So running multiple copies of Dance can not only advance Sparkle itself, but also the entire team. So one support that can really benefit from this is Sparkle plus Ting Yuan, alright? And then they both help each other reach their respective speed thresholds much more easily, right? So that is another option. If you guys don't want to run S5 Duns, then S1 Bronya Lightcone battle isn't over. It's also a decent alternative, especially since Sparkle's action value advance usually means that after casting Sparkle skill, your DPS will be the next unit following Sparkle skill, allowing our DPS to benefit from Bronya's S1 damage percentage buff. The energy regeneration from Bronya's Lightcone is not really useful since she's still very far away from a 2-turn ultimate. Also, furthermore, additional skill point from Bronya's ultimate could also be very useful. We do have high skill point usage DPS such as Qingque and Imbibitor Lune. And lastly, S5 Past and Future and Planetary Rendezvous. Between both of these Lightcones, Planetary Rendezvous is a little bit less preferred than Past and Future since it has 8% less damage buff, and Past and Future should proc more consistently due to Sparkle's action value advance, which is the same concept as Bronya's S1, right? So unless a dual DPS mono quantum team comp arises in the future, or even right now if you guys are using crit DPS Silver Wolf, then Planetary Rendezvous don't really have as much of a value than S5 Past and Future. And moving on to our final part of our Sparkle's analysis, which is her team compositions. I will be doing a lot more in-depth in another separate video, but this is a more general guide for players, right? Sparkle's role, it is mainly tied to being a hybrid carry support, similar to Hanya, Bronya, and Tingyun. Although it might be viable to run Sparkle in a dual DPS team comp by using her as a basic attack bot, right? You only use basic attack and you just plus 7 skill points to sustain our 2 skill point consumers. The lack of crit damage buff and actual value advance does not translate well to optimal gameplay, and as such, Ramei, Pella, Asta, they will be much more preferred for a dual DPS team comp. And also, I think it goes without saying, Sparkle is not good for DOT team comps, right? So that's that. Notable DPS, notable hyper carry DPS that Sparkle can work well with pretty much includes all of our crit hyper carries, right? Qingque, Imbibitor Lune, Scylla, Blade, Jingliu, they're all gonna be really well with Sparkle since they scale with crit damage and action value advance is always going to be a good thing. For Mono Quantum in particular, the biggest benefit would lie from Silver Wolf's Quantum Implant to overcome off element stages, and that is something that is very beneficial for players with subpar relic quality. But don't tie Sparkle to only Mono Quantum because she's definitely much more than that. And an example would be another class of hyper carries that is the follow-up attackers, namely Jingyuan, Topaz, Dr. Ratio, and even Clara, right? Because all of them can benefit from Sparkle's skill buffs as it extends to the start of their next turn. More details will be provided in a Sparkle's future team analysis, so stay tuned. And with that, we have come to the end of Sparkle's CN unit analysis. If you guys want to engage in further discussions, feel free to hop onto my Discord at discord.gg/Pokke's Village, where we have a very active community talking about honkaistarrail on a daily basis. If you guys check out my stream, that's going to be at twitch.tv/MrPokke. I'll be streaming almost every single day, and I'll be also streaming on YouTube Live as well, right? Schedule will be updated on Discord. That's all I have for today. All the best for Sparkle pools, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.
I genuinely cannot believe this shit. I genuinely cannot believe this shit. I genuinely cannot believe this shit, guys. Did I say how I genuinely cannot believe this shit? I genuinely cannot believe this shit, guys.